The seventh volume in her true crime. The seventh volume in her true crime franchise, The Best New True Crime Stories, Crimes of the Famous and Infamous, will be published in 2023. You can follow her on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Mitzi Szereto. Janel Comeau is a writer, blogger, podcaster, comedian, and human services worker currently residing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. She is a regular contributor to satire news website, The Beaverton, and co-host of the true crime podcast, Histories and Mysteries with Jessica and Janelle. Her work has previously appeared in The Best New True Crime Stories, Well-Mannered Crooks, Rogues, and Criminals. Lindsey Danis is a queer writer of fiction and essays and a contributor to our featured anthology. Her writing has appeared in Condé Nast Traveler, Afar, Hodors, and Long Range. Lindsey's essays have received a notable mention in Best American Travel Writing and are forthcoming in anthologies from PM Press, Alternating Currents Press, and elsewhere. Her work centers LGBTQ voices with a focus on honoring LGBTQ history, celebrating queer joy, and expanding the types of queer stories that get told. When not writing, Lindsey is often found hiking or kayaking near her Hudson Valley home. So thank you, Mitzi, Janelle, and Lindsey for being here with us once again. I do have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please feel free to throw a question into the comments field. If you're on our Zoom platform, you can type your question right into the Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the discussion. And thank you so much. I'm going to turn off my camera and my mic, and I'm going to let the three of you chat. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone for joining us, especially Hards who were planning to attend in September, and we had to postpone that since I decided to fracture my shoulder. So thanks for showing up again today. I'm really happy to be here with my two contributors, and excited about the book. Flash it over here. And we've got Lindsey and Janelle, our contributors, as was mentioned. Just to say, this is the sixth volume in the series, and each volume is set with a different theme. And Unsolved Crimes and Mysteries pretty much is what it says on the tin. And so I thought I'd start out a bit about asking everyone about their professional backgrounds. I'll go first since I'm already talking. I've been writing and editing for a couple of decades now. I write fiction and nonfiction. And actually, I did my undergraduate studies in journalism. And I found that when I started to do true crime, I was sort of dusting off those skills and bringing them back into play. So I guess things don't always go dormant when you study at university. Sometimes they'll be useful at a later date. So I kind of, that's basically where I ended up with the true crime, was just relying on my journalism skills again, and also creative writing skills as well. But first, since Janelle is on the screen, would you tell us a bit about your professional background? I know we kind of was mentioned earlier, but tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I definitely can. So I actually have my master's degree in forensic psychology from Columbia University in New York. I have spent my entire career working in the human services field. As I've mentioned, I've worked in homeless shelters, I've worked with at-risk youth, I've worked with folks experiencing homelessness on the street. So that is what I do for a day job. True crime has always been an interest of mine. I have unfortunately worked with some folks who've experienced some not so great things. But it's always just been something that drew me. So I do write on the side. I write comedy and true crime, and those are the two things that I focus on.
Interestingly, your degree, do you think that was something that got you interested in true crime, or was it the other way around?
It was sort of both. It kind of came from, started out in general psychology. That's my undergraduate degree is in. Really interested in abnormal psychology and taking more classes in criminal psychology. And at the same time, my parents had always had 48 Hours Mystery on the TV. So it's hard to say where it all started, but it's all, the more I learn, the more interested I become.
Yeah, I get you there. Lindsey, so how about you? Tell us a bit more about your background.
Yeah, sure. So for about a dozen years now, I've been freelance writing. So I have an MFA in fiction. I fell into writing just to make a living doing something I liked. And these days I write primarily about food, travel, and LGBTQ topics for a variety of magazines and online publications. So right now I'm working on a book of essays about queer travel that explores some of the challenges with traveling while queer, some of which are discussed in my essay in this collection, and ultimately take the reader on a quest for moments of joy and transformation. And then on the fiction side of things, I'm working on a new novel that's a Frankenstein retelling in which two true crime broadcasters take a road trip in a van that haunts them. And I'll be drawing on some of my trips when working on that book. This essay is my first foray into true crime, so who knows, there may be more of that in my future as well.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope so. We don't want to give all of our cards, show all of our cards to our viewers, but would you each give us a brief overview of your story? Janel, do you want to tell us a bit about your piece, which is called In a Field Outside of Edmonton, which is Edmonton in Alberta, Canada?
Yes. So Edmonton is my hometown. That's where I grew up. And since the late 1980s, around 30 to 40 women have disappeared in the city of Edmonton under very similar circumstances. So typically these are women who are disappearing from the downtown core of Edmonton, 118th Avenue in Edmonton, which is a well-known prostitution stroll. These are overwhelmingly sex workers from a First Nations, Métis, or Indigenous background. They're almost always found dumped in fields outside of the city, hence the name of the story. And that is usually the extent of the news coverage that these cases received, that a body was found in a field outside of Edmonton and that the case is unsolved. So although there have been maybe one or two of these cases that there's been an arrest made, there are more than 30 that remain unsolved with virtually no progress and very little media coverage in the decades that it's been happening. Like I mentioned, I grew up in Edmonton and I did not know that this was a thing until 2015 when I graduated university and began working in the field and began working with some of the women who were affected by this or who had known people who were affected by this. So it was really there is effectively probably one of the most prolific serial killers in North American history who has been active in Alberta for 30 years and has never been caught. And there's very little coverage of this. So I really wanted to use this opportunity to write about a case that I'm very familiar with, but of which there is virtually no media coverage other than a handful of articles from the time when it really hit its peak. And it's a really interesting case because there was a very similar case in Vancouver at about the same time period when they caught Robert Pickton, who is the most prolific serial killer in Canadian history. Same thing, he was kidnapping and killing Indigenous sex workers. There was a lot of heat that came down on the Vancouver Police Department for that and for the failure to investigate the case. But in Edmonton, there was just no interest. So that is why I chose to take that case on.
Yeah, that's something that I think, it's on both sides of the border. This is an issue, and it's unfortunate that it isn't getting airplay, so to speak. I think it's improving, and there is more of an emphasis on this. There's that new television series, what's it, the Alaska Daily, or what's it called? I don't know. Lindsay, do you know the one?
This one.
Yeah. Anyways, it's set in Alaska, and it's all about, each time the show ends, they have an announcement about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and
Oh, wow.
so but there's clearly a long way to go. And as an aside, when you and I were going back and forth with the fact checking, and we had missing dates, and I asked you, I said, well, don't we know exactly when they disappeared or when they died or whatever? And you said, nobody really was too concerned about facts and reporting and recording information.
No, and I you would have gone through all the sources that I did. So many of the headlines were simply like prostitute slain, and that was the end of the news coverage, which is just really a horrific thing to see, especially where there's so many of those families that are still looking and still trying to get news coverage. It's just less degrading.
Yeah, it's dehumanizing. Yeah, exactly. Lindsey, give us a bit of an overview on your piece, which is called 25 Years Later, This AT Lesbian Double Murder Still Haunts Me. And that's pretty much sums up how you tell your story.
That sums it up, but I'll go into a little more detail. So the case is 25 years old. Two women hikers were murdered in Shenandoah National Park, and the case is still unsolved. So in my essay, I talk about the crime, what happened, and also the additional hurdles that come up when there is a crime on public lands in terms of who has jurisprudence over the investigation. And these two women were lovers, but they weren't out publicly. So their family members actually learned that they were together only in the aftermath of the crime when they were outed by one of their pastors. So it's a little bit opposite to Janel's case in that this case had just such a huge media response, and the women's sexuality was really sensationalized in the media coverage. And because of that, the prosecutors were able to charge the initial suspect under a hate crime law and request the death penalty for him. So as I talk about in the essay, the case fell apart down the road due to advances in DNA analysis, and they were able to determine that the original suspect was no longer a match. So the case remains unsolved today, 25 years later after the women's death. And I talk about, the long impact that it has had on me. And I think, especially in the light of the Colorado Springs mass shooting last week, or maybe the week before, of LGBTQ people, it's just crimes like this keep us feeling unsafe almost no matter where we are.
Yeah. And also the fact of women in general being unsafe no matter where they are as well. But so we have sort of a double thing here happening in the story. Go bounce back to Janel. What inspired you to write your story? You were saying that because you have worked with some of these women and it just sort of made you more aware, or you felt that maybe it just needed to be told and get more and more out there?
Yeah, it was sort of, I had written about the case for crack.com a number of years ago, and which is a comedy site, but that does, yes, that does a lot of a surprising amount of true crime coverage. So I did a lot of true crime writing for that. And it was sort of like that article is the most widely read piece of news coverage about this, which is horrifying. And it was a lot of working with these women directly. I do know some of the women who are on the list of missing women included in the story, because this is still ongoing. The most recent disappearance was last summer. And it was working with these women. I came from a very privileged background. I came from a very sheltered background. I grew up in the suburbs on the edge of Edmonton. And so it was me being, 22 years old in my first human services job, having to give safety talks in young Indigenous sex workers that was like, hey, serial killer safety talks. So it was something that, so it was something that really stuck with me, especially where the police response to this case was something called Project Care. And what this was that because they knew there was a serial killer out, they encouraged women to register their DNA in advance so that when their bodies were found, they could be identified. And that was the main police response to this. So I was helping young women register their DNA with the police so that their bodies could be identified, which was just an absolutely horrifying thing, and just so outraged me and so stayed with me that there was no public outcry about this, that people were just okay with this or just content to not know that it was happening. So it's been a case that I've written about over and over again, in that it's still ongoing. There's still women going missing, and there's just that public outcry has never happened.
Oh, I mean, I wonder if in other communities, if we were asked to register, have our DNA registered, and when our bodies are found, as if it's a fait accompli. I just can't imagine other communities would just fluff this off or not be out there shrieking in the streets. That's insane.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Lindsey, your story, you tell it a lot. You tell it from the first person, and as I mentioned to in podcast interviews, that you just sort of, the way you tell it, we are there with you, and we feel the fear. We feel the fear of these women, and we feel your fear when you're actually retracing their steps. So just tell us a bit about what inspired you about this particular story, since obviously there are unfortunately many stories.
Yeah. Well, I had gone on a hiking trip to the White Mountains in New Hampshire as a young person with my mom and a family friend and her kids. And it was just a wonderful, like 3-day hiking trip. You know, we hiked from like hut to hut in the mountains, and we summited Mount Washington. And I was just blown away because I didn't do things like that as a kid. And I didn't know there were things like that. And on that trip, I was like, I'm going to come back one day. I'm going to hike the Appalachian Trail, you know, the whole thing, like from Georgia to Maine. And I'm just going to have this big adventure. And then, you know, a few years later, I heard about this case, and it just instantly, you know, I knew that this big hike that I had really wanted to do just was off the table for me. You know, I remember seeing like the news clipping and seeing the faces of these women and thinking, you know, they look like me, they look like the camp counselors, you know, that I knew. And if it could happen to them in this national park, you know, steps away from the Appalachian Trail, well, it could certainly happen to me. And so the only logical conclusion that I came to as a teenager is just that I had to stay home. You know, and the case has stayed with me all these years since. And, you know, I wanted to just have a place to investigate the case and the questions that it asks, you know, us as readers and travelers about, you know, what is adventure and who is it for? And what is the price of adventure and who has to pay it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, even it's been a widely reported on case, as we know, but putting yourself into the story, I think, just gives that extra impact. And as I said, just anyone reading it can follow along and really understand what it must have been like for them. And even in your own case, where you were with your wife at the time, was it? And there was some rather unsavory characters nearby that made you in sort of an intimidating, threatening manner in which they were acting. So, I mean, you could just imagine what it was like for them, and even wonder if yourself if you were next.
Yeah, we were walking around the campground like after midnight, after we'd had this run-in with this group of people, and I was just like, what am I supposed to do? And it was, you know, one of those things that truth is stranger than fiction. And if I had put it in a novel, it would have been too surreal. But, you know, there I am in the scene where it happened, feeling completely unsafe and under-resourced and having to figure something out right in the middle of the night. And how could I keep myself safe? And what was I willing to do?
Especially, you know, I think the whole thing too, being in the national park like this, and a place, as you mentioned, that is supposed to belong to all of us, all Americans, and a place that we're supposed to be safe to go to visit and enjoy. And that's not always the case, sadly. At least it certainly wasn't for these women.
No, I know. And I think it's that you want to believe that nothing bad can happen in a place that beautiful. And, you know, that's the reality is very different.
Yeah. Well, I know I for a brief time I lived near the Appalachian Trail in the North Georgia mountains, and I believe I was hearing about there were some murders up and down the AT that just weren't solved either. So it's sad. I guess that's probably why I never really hiked too far, aside from the fact I'm kind of lazy, but I didn't go very far, just on the fringe near the road. So Janel, we'll pop back to you again. You mentioned about the impact. I was saying you were saying about these crimes just seem to nobody seemed very interested in them and being reported on. People, you know, nobody's up in arms about them. I mean, the impact on the particular crimes in your story, the impact on society, it doesn't seem like there was that great an impact, other than perhaps on the First Nations communities themselves, but on society overall, it doesn't seem like it had an impact.
Yeah, I mean, obviously for the communities that were directly affected, devastating, but it's so interesting that even two of the young women disappeared from the West Edmonton Mall, which is one of the largest tourist attractions in the area. It's where I spent all of my time as a child. Edmonton's cold in the wintertime. You drop your teenager off at the mall. That's there's nothing else to do. And it's interesting that like two young women could be kidnapped from this mall and murdered, and it would create such little news impact. I never heard about it. My parents never heard about it. Nobody ever heard about it. And, you know, normally when you have these crimes, any crime that's affecting a young person, a child, a teenager, there is always sort of this response. a lot of caution, a lot of fear. And in this case, it was sort of like just silence. These were young Indigenous runaways. And there was just not an interest in what had happened to them. So it was interesting to live in this community and to be looking back. It was interesting to write this and look back on it reflexively, because I was growing up as all this was happening. A lot of this started in, these cases really started in the late 80s, but they really were, a lot of them between the late 90s to sort of the 2007. And it was interesting to have been growing up in Edmonton and reflecting back now, doing all of this research, reflecting on it and thinking, like, was this something that was present in my life? Was this something that was talked about? Even my parents read the story after it came out. They got a copy of the book, and even they were shocked. And they were adults when this was happening. They were much more exposed to the news and these sorts of things. And they were surprised to learn that they had been completely unaware of what was happening.
It is unbelievable, especially from the mall. I mean, normally if a kid or a teenager goes missing from the mall, that's going to get major coverage as a sort of a, a warning to other, teens and parents. And, this is, you have to be careful. But in this case, just tumbleweeds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Lindsey, in your case, in your story, it sounds like there was a bit more impact on society, that this particular double murder did get attention and whatnot. So why do you think that is? I mean, because it was women, because it was lesbian women. But why was this so different from, for instance, with Janel's murder victims in her story?
I think the lesbian angle was definitely a part of it. I think the fact that it happened in a national park, which we all think of as a safe place, was definitely part of it. I mean, I also think part of it was the time, it happened at a time when gay rights were very much don't ask, don't tell, and people weren't out. And so all of a sudden, to have lesbians murdered, it was just a huge story. And I think the media can sometimes run with those things and create a frenzy, and then that can have a ripple effect in society. I think also with women, that's the case where there has been progress and it feels like things are changing. And then whenever there are crimes like this, it just reminds us, like, oh, we maybe take these things for granted that we shouldn't. And it always comes back to the victim. Like, we shouldn't go to these places. We shouldn't be outside late at night. We shouldn't wear this or that or attract attention to ourselves. And so I think women just get angry that nothing changes and that we're still asked to take the responsibility for anything bad that might happen to us.
Yeah, it seems you can't win no matter what you do. If you went down one street, it was an hour past your bedtime, you wore something that, I mean, if you're going to a nightclub or on a date, and then, that it's you're blamed for it, or somehow there's always some way to try to find some way to say that maybe you brought it on yourself. I mean, like in Janelle's case, they're all blamed because they were sex workers. So that clearly they were asking to be murdered, right?
Right. There's a morality thing there where it's, okay to not care about those women because of what they're doing or even the background that those women have. And it's deeply frustrating to me as a person committed to equity, but.
Yeah. And then in your story, it was just I guess these two women had the nerve to want to go hiking and enjoying the nature on their own without a man.
Right. And, did he see them kiss or something? Was there something that they did to make him kill them? And, it comes back to the same, policing women's behavior.
Yeah. I guess nothing does change. There's quite a number of stories in the book, actually, that we see this again and again and again, and you can't ignore the pattern. I didn't intentionally choose stories that had that sort of thing happening. It just keeps repeating itself no matter what. When the woman is a victim, somewhere or other, it always ends up being where there's some sort of assumption that maybe something she did brought this on. So, Oh well, maybe in 100 years we'll still have the same conversation. I don't know. So we were saying about society's attitudes towards these crimes, like in for instance, in Janelle's story. Again, there just doesn't seem to be any attitude other than the fact that they didn't even matter. Janelle, would you say that was pretty much the case? These victims didn't matter?
Yeah, that's been an ongoing struggle across the country, where Indigenous women make up a very small percentage of Canadian women, and they make up a hugely disproportionate number of missing women across the country. And there has been a lot of activism in recent years nationwide about missing and murdered Indigenous women. The Red Dress campaign, which is a campaign where activists will hang up red dresses on May 5th to represent dresses that these women never got to wear. So there's been really a lot of effort to make it visual and visceral and a thing that people can engage with, just out of frustration with the lack of attention that these cases get. There was a serial killer arrested in Winnipeg today, who is suspected to have committed a whole bunch of killings of Indigenous women in Winnipeg that he got away with for a significant amount of time. So this is not, even though the case very much focuses on Edmonton and is very based in, my hometown and the particular geography of the region, Edmonton is quite isolated. There's nothing. It's a large city of 1 million people in a big sea of rural area that is quite untraversed. So the geography of the region plays into how easy it was to get away with these crimes and to hide these women's bodies for years. But at the same time, this happens in every city. Vancouver had this happen. Winnipeg has ongoing issues with this. So we really see this nationwide with the killings of Indigenous women and the activism that their home communities are doing, and just the lack of response. There's been calls for inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous women for years that the federal government has not been overly responsive to, despite just the sheer numbers of it.
This is actually making me think, because in both of your stories, really, but it almost sounds like it has an element of a hate crime, that perhaps why are these women being targeted, that they're all so overwhelmingly First Nations women? I mean, what is the deal there? I mean, I'm assuming they're not being murdered by other First Nations people.
It's there's a famous true crime podcast called Last Podcast on the Left, which is a tongue-in-cheek kind of comedy podcast, but they have this concept they talk about a lot called the least dead, which is sort of like there are victims that we see as the most dead little missing white girls, and there's victims we see as the least dead. Their deaths are statistics, their noise, they don't matter. And Indigenous sex workers are people who frequently come up as this sort of like, their deaths are not seen as tragedies. Their deaths are seen as sort of a social ill, or just a fact of life, which is horrific. And I think it's a combination of, obviously, Canada has a very ugly history with our Indigenous people and the ways that we have marginalized them and the ways that we have pushed them to the outer edges of society. For a long time in Canada, Indigenous children were removed from their homes forcibly and were forced to attend residential boarding schools that were horrifically abusive. There has been a big push across Canada the last year, 2 years, finding the remains of children at the sites of these schools because they were so horrifically abusive. And the last of these schools didn't close until the early 1990s. So this is not distant history. This is things that people are still living with this trauma today. And it has led to a lot of mental health issues. It has led to addictions. It has led to family breakdown. Indigenous folks are not granted the same opportunities that other Canadians are. They are still, reservations are underserviced. A lot of them have boil watery advisories that you can't drink the water on reserves. They don't have internet. It's a horrific way to treat people. And the more we marginalize people, the easier it is to victimize them. So I do think it's quite likely people go after Indigenous sex workers knowing that they're unlikely to be reported missing. People are not going to search for them. It's a problem that's been created and perpetuated by just the oppression that these women face.
Lindsey, in your story, so obviously because you were saying that maybe because they were lesbian, they got more, there was more interest in the story, perhaps because of the uniqueness at the time, since it wasn't really that, it was, people were more closeted then.
Yeah, which is a double-edged sword because, I think like all victims deserve that level of seriousness and the attempts to identify their killer and to bring justice to bear. But, the unfortunate reality, I feel like, is that there's just so many cases that people have to pick and choose where are they going to focus their efforts on, and which, a victim feels more worthy or, is going to be more newsworthy, which is a terrible thing to say. And I would prefer we move to a different sort of reality, but
yeah,
it's not
well, I
up to
mean,
me.
it sounds like there's a possibility. I mean, I guess we'll never know. We'll never know unless they actually catch the killer. But if this might have even have been a hate crime, like you were saying, if somebody was there observing the ladies and they were, interacting in a way that as a couple would interact, anyone else would interact, but this particular individual just didn't like that, and killed them because of that. I don't know. I mean, I suppose we'll never know, but it does
Yeah,
sound
or
like there's a possibility.
if they had a history of violence against women and they encountered these women and they decided to take advantage of them, that too is something that could have happened. And unfortunately, there's just too many things that we don't know this many years later. And, that the possibility of new information seems vanishingly small.
Yeah, although it's still recent enough that it's not an impossibility that, some the old proverbial deathbed confession thing or something like that might happen, at least to give closure to some, family members. But so we'll switch a bit from talking about your stories, and I'd like to ask you about your approaches to writing true crime. Since Lindsey's still here, you want to tell us a bit? I know that you said this is your first actual true crime story
It
that you've written.
is, yes. It is, but I watch a lot of crime shows, police shows, detective shows, true crime shows. So I feel like that gave me some familiarity into what would make the story compelling for the reader. And so when writing it, I wanted to balance that kind of reporting and facts of the case and really describing everything that happened with that sort of analysis and with the personal angle. And it was fortunate for me that the case was so very well known, as there were a lot of really well researched and reported articles from the time that I could draw on in my own research.
Yeah, well, hopefully you'll do some more. I mean, I think that's the whole thing is having that reporting background, because then that kind of keeps you on track with facts. When this is supposed to be nonfiction, even if it's called true crime, it's true. So that's the point. Janel, how about you? How do you approach true crime? So I know you've written this. You've written a piece in the Well-Mannered Crooks, Rogues, and Criminals book, and you have your podcast. So how do you actually approach true crime writing?
I think for me, especially where you're covering cases, I know my first case that I covered in an anthology with you was hundreds of years old. So that one had some, that was a little bit different. But for covering cases, especially where the families are still alive and the families are still interested, I think it's so important to think about how you are framing this. There is a lot of power in being the person to report on a story, and what facts you choose to highlight and which you don't. And I think especially where a lot of the source material for this is pretty bad, it's not great. And just the framing of it, even the fact that in most of these women's like body found or missing persons article, they use their mugshots as like the picture of them. Like there's so much that's not great. For me, it was a really important reminder that like really being cognizant of like the power that you hold as the person who's telling somebody else's story, especially a person who's from a marginalized community that you do not belong to, and just being really cognizant of like, one, accuracy, and two, like just what you choose to include. The fact that somebody is a mother, the fact that somebody was a passionate sports player, the fact that somebody was a dedicated dancer. When you omit those things, you choose how you're framing the person, you choose how you're framing your victim. So just trying to present, victims as whole people, even when there's 40 of them, and not simply as statistics and not simply as slain prostitute.
Yeah, a one-dimensional portrait. I mean, I'm the same way. I've been writing pieces that were more recent, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that there could be somebody out there reading it that is a family member, a friend, whomever, and I just feel that I don't want to kind of stick the knife in more, so to speak. I mean, some of these cases are pretty horrendous. Some of the criminals are pretty horrendous. But again, it's you don't want to just rub it in so much. It's kind of keeping that balance of reporting the facts, giving information, but not to the point where you're kind of just making things worse for someone. I mean, because someone's out there somewhere and they might read it. I had that happen with a story I wrote about a gentleman, bank robber, so to speak, and he basically financially just ended up in a huge hole, and he didn't know. He was like in Texas. He was just this sort of typical God-fearing type, very spiritual, religious, family man, and he turned to bank robbery. And he was not bank robbery. I'm sorry. He just turned to robbery. He was going to hotels and holding people up. And I was thinking, well, I know his wife is still alive, and I don't want to kind of portray him in this horrible way. I mean, he died, and yes, he was convicted for his crimes, but he was still a human being, and he had his reasons, so to speak, for whatever it was he did. And so, yeah, it's always that in the back of your mind about, who's reading it. And you don't want to necessarily create a monster out of someone who isn't a monster. I mean, if they are a monster, so be it. I mean, if they're Ted Bundy, so be it. There's not a lot of great things one can say about Ted Bundy. So exactly, it's just kind of keeping that balance going. So we just kind of amplifies what we were just talking about. But as far as true crime, I'm sure you're both going to say an overwhelming yes. But do you think that true crime carries a heavier burden than other forms of writing?
Yes, I do. I think there's a lot of power, like I said, in choosing which stories you tell, how you tell them. And to Lindsay's point, like media coverage is not always a net good. If you're sensationalizing the life of somebody because like some detail about their identity or who they are makes them sort of like a curiosity or something to be gawked at, that's not necessarily a net good. And I think there have been stories of families that have really struggled with like the podcasts and the attention that their loved one's crime has brought on the family. There have been families who have made it quite clear that they don't appreciate some of the coverage that their loved one gets on true crime shows or in true crime podcasts. So I think there is a huge ethical responsibility in writing true crime. There can be such an ethical gray area where you are writing about human suffering. And I think it's very important to kind of keep in mind what your purpose is for telling that particular story in the way that you're telling it.
Yeah, I kind of think the same thing about some of these cases just seem to get so much coverage. And I hate to think about what these people must feel like, these family members, just having this constantly out there. I mean, true crime is fascinating, but maybe sometimes there's a limit to how much of it we need to keep putting out there, especially on specific cases. Lindsay, what's your take on that?
I'd say I feel similar to Janel in that, it all really comes down to intent and why are we going back to these stories, especially if they're old stories? Why are we telling them? What are we hoping to convey about this that's new or that feels urgent to right now? Like, how can these cases inform the things that we're all dealing with right now? And are there times when it's just better not to tell the story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's also an importance, like I try to look for stories that will make people think a little bit, not just reading about a crime and just absorbing the facts of the crime, but something to think about, like, well, for instance, like I had a story about the mass shooting in Tasmania some years ago and how that immediately enacted gun control in Tasmania and all of Australia. And I think the whole point of that was, I would hope that other countries, particularly in the United States, why is it in the United States we have mass shootings and mass murder like as a national sport, and nothing is done about guns? And you hope that maybe somebody might read a story and say, if another country can do that and it really did work, why can't this country do it? So you do hope there's some food for thought in some of these stories, and maybe someone who has the authority to do something about it might do something about it. But of course, we all live in the fairy tale land hoping for that. Well, I almost feel as if the story that I wrote for the book, because I always write a story for my books, since I'm the boss and I can do that and it won't get rejected. But I feel like mine's a bit of comic relief compared to yours. But I actually wrote a piece about an actor who is found dead, and we don't quite know if he was murdered or if he might have just died from some mishap. And I don't want to give it away, but it's David Lynch is involved, and I'll just dangle that carrot. So you could figure it's going to be pretty surreal. So is there anything either of you would like to add before we get our host back? And if we have any questions from people, I'm not sure, but anything you want to just mention? Janel, since you're here.
I don't think so. Folks should read the book. It's great. There's a lot of really, really great stories that are covered. And such a great diversity of stories, which is it's really interesting to read through all of the stories in the anthology and see how many common threads there are, even though they come from all over the world, all kinds of time periods, just to see, you know, really a story about like marginalization and, you know, just the forces that people are up against in their lives and how common that can be around the world.
Yeah, exactly. Lindsey?
Yeah, no, nothing to add. Just thank you for organizing this and putting out these series of true crime stories out there.
You know, I kind of
It's
wish
been fun
in a way
to take part.
Yeah, it would be so cool if we can have like everybody on, because I mean, each story is so special and unique and told in a special way. And they're all different, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of common threads that we see. But I think it would be really hard to get, like, what did we have, 15 people in the book? I don't know. It'd be like a marathon event here. So I don't know. There's our host, Stella.
Hi. I have a question for
Okay.
Mitzi mostly. So I wanted to know about your process for selecting contributors, and I also wanted to know about how you curate these stories or how you select the stories.
I put out my calls for submission as widely as I can, and it gets bounced all over the place thanks to the internet. It's amazing. I mean, I hear from people in such far-flung places. I'm just like shocked. So I asked people to pitch their idea to me. And of course, you know, a lot of true crime cases have been done to death. And if somebody wants to do something that's had a lot of coverage, I kind of emphasize to them, you know, can you give this some unique spin or something or other? If you have a connection to the case, like in Lindsey's specific case, she put herself in this story, something like that. So I'll get the proposal, just a short 1-paragraph proposal, and then, or pitch rather, and then I'll just say, yeah, it's promising. I'm not promising you're in the book, but you're in the right direction, and I'd be definitely interested if you can turn this in and it works. So that's the step we go to. Then people send me the stories, and then I just, you know, I kind of look like, I feel like I'm casting a film. That's kind of how I do these books. It's like casting a film. I want to have a diverse group of stories, an interesting group of writers, stories from different countries, different time frames, a nice mix. So I'll get into stories. Sometimes I'll know from the pitch if I'm like, I know that I just know it is going to work. You know, maybe I know the writer as well, so I know they can do what they're going to say they're going to do. Yeah, so I'll just start reviewing the stories as they come in. I select as I go along, so I kind of tell people don't dawdle to the last minute because I might have a full book by then. And we go from there. Some of the stories don't need a lot of work. Sometimes I'll see something that maybe, you know, could have been expanded on, or a little bit of a different direction to go in. So my editorial hat is always on. And I do work with the writers, sometimes just a little bit, sometimes quite a lot. And then we just get the stories whipped into as best shape as possible and make them as good as possible, and they go in the book.
Wonderful. Yeah, I really appreciate.
And then we do the fact checking, which is the most painful experience in the world.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate the diversity, and especially, you know, retelling, or not retelling because these are new, you know, telling these stories of these people who are in a lot of cases marginalized, and that's such a huge thing in true crime because as you all touched on, you've got your like Gabby Petito cases that are very widely covered. And so it's super important to have that visibility on that. And I know that this was pretty well touched on, but I had it pre-written, so I wanted to see if there were any other insights. But this anthology, as evidenced by the discussion tonight, is clearly full of compassion for the victims, and it feels very humanizing rather than voyeuristic. There tends to be a perception with retelling true crime stories that victims can be exploited and re-victimized. So how do you, as a writer or an editor, balance fascination with empathy? And what's like that happy, medium?
Well, I kind of put in my specs for that I don't want anything sensationalized. I don't want that kind of thing. That's not the kind of true crime I want to do. And as you said, whether it's the victim or it's the perpetrator, there are some things that are sensationalist in a lot of these true crime stories. It's just the nature of the particular crimes, but that doesn't mean we need to be prurient about it. And that's the kind of thing I really discourage. And I have had people send stories, nobody here today, but I've had stories that have come in and I'm like, I'm not putting, I wouldn't touch this with a barge pole. I don't want that kind of stuff in my book. I want thought-provoking, thoughtful, considerate pieces of work that are telling a story about a crime, some of which could be pretty heinous crimes, but done in a way that is respectful and intelligent and will hopefully give the reader something to think about.
Yeah. And I think that's something that is missing, especially from like a media perspective, because that just gets blown out so often. And then, like Netflix will pick something up or whatever, and it becomes a whole circus.
Yeah, and heavily fictionalized as well, which is kind of takes away from the true part of true crime.
Absolutely. Well, I don't have any other questions, but I did drop a link to the book in our chat, and just to remind everyone, that is the best new true crime stories, Unsolved Crimes and Mysteries. And I wanted to thank you all so much for joining us, Mitzi, Lindsey, and Janel. It was truly a pleasure. It was such a fascinating discussion. And I hope you have a wonderful holiday season coming up if you celebrate. And I just want to let everyone know that you can get the book on our website, and you can also order it in our stores and make a great gift for yourself or for your loved ones who like.
Excellent gift. Everybody needs a copy. Friends, family, neighbors, the postman, everybody needs a copy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you as well.
Bye.
Take care.